Michael Jackson stood alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection under the harsh fluorescent lights. It was 1984, and the world saw him as invincible, the king of pop, the man who could moonwalk across any stage and command millions with a single note. But tonight, something felt different. His hands trembled as he adjusted his sequin jacket, and memories he'd buried deep began clawing their way to the surface. Outside, thousands of fans screamed his name. But inside this small room, Michael was drowning in silence. He closed his eyes and was transported back to a moment he'd never spoken about publicly, a moment that had shaped everything he'd become. It was 1978, before the world knew his name beyond the Jackson 5. He was driving through Los Angeles late one evening after a recording session when he noticed smoke billowing from an apartment building. Most people would have driven past, called for help, maybe stopped to watch. Michael's heart told him something else. He pulled over without thinking, his mind racing faster than his pulse. Through the chaos of gathering onlookers and distant sirens, he heard something that made his blood run cold, a child's scream piercing through the night air. A young girl, no more than 7 years old, was trapped on the third floor, her small face pressed against a window thick with smoke. Firefighters hadn't arrived yet. Every second mattered. Michael looked around desperately, knowing that waiting meant losing her. In that split second, he made a decision that would haunt and define him forever. This wasn't about fame or heroism. This was about a terrified child who reminded him of his own stolen innocence, and he couldn't turn away. Michael burst through the building's entrance before anyone could stop him. The heat hit him like a physical wall, stealing the air from his lungs and searing his throat. Smoke twisted through the hallways in thick, black columns, making it nearly impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. He pulled his jacket over his mouth and nose, dropping to his knees where the air was slightly clearer. The child's cries grew louder, guiding him like a desperate beacon through the darkness. Each step felt like moving through a nightmare where time stretched and collapsed simultaneously. His eyes burned and watered, making the world blur into shadows and orange flames that licked hungrily at the walls. Michael crawled forward, ignoring the scorching heat beneath his palms and the way his lungs screamed for clean oxygen. Behind him, he could hear people shouting, telling him to come back, that help was coming. But help wasn't there yet, and this child didn't have time for eventually. He reached the stairwell and forced himself upward, using the railing to pull his body forward when his legs threatened to give out. The smoke grew thicker with each floor, and twice he had to stop, pressing his face against the ground to find breathable air. The girl's screams had turned to sobs now, weaker, more frightened. Michael called out to her, his voice rough and strained, telling her to hold on, that someone was coming for her. When he finally reached the third floor, flames had consumed the hallway's far end, advancing steadily toward the apartment where she was trapped. He had minutes, maybe less. Michael stood, adrenaline overriding every instinct telling him to flee, and moved toward her door. The metal doorknob burned his hand when he touched it, but he wrapped his jacket around it and twisted with everything he had. The door gave way with a crash that sent Michael stumbling into the smoke-filled apartment. The little girl huddled in the corner of the living room, her arms wrapped around her knees, eyes wide with terror. She looked at him like he was a ghost materializing from her worst nightmare. Michael dropped beside her, his voice gentle despite the chaos roaring around them. He told her his name, told her she was going to be okay, that he'd get her out. She didn't recognize him. To her, he was just a stranger brave enough or crazy enough to walk into hell for someone he'd never met. She latched onto him with surprising strength, her small body shaking violently. Michael lifted her, cradling her against his chest, and turned back toward the door. But the flames had spread faster than he'd anticipated. The hallway they just traversed was now completely engulfed, a river of fire blocking their only exit. His mind raced through impossible calculations, searching for another way out. The windows, they were their only chance. He moved to the nearest one, kicking it open with his foot. Fresh air rushed in, momentarily clearing the smoke and giving him a precious moment of clarity. They were 3 stories up. Jumping meant serious injury or worse. Staying meant certain death. Below, a crowd had gathered, and someone had spread out a large tarp, held by at least a dozen people. Firefighters were shouting instructions, their voices barely audible over the fire's roar. Michael looked down at the girl in his arms. She'd stopped crying, her face buried against his shoulder, trusting him completely. That trust felt heavier than anything he'd ever carried. He positioned himself on the window ledge, wrapping his arms tighter around her small frame, whispering promises he prayed he could keep. Michael jumped. For a moment, they were suspended in empty air, gravity pulling them down while time seemed to stop entirely. The girl's scream merged with his own racing heartbeat, and then they hit the tarp with jarring force. The impact knocked the wind from his lungs, and pain exploded through his shoulder and ribs. But the crowd had caught them. Hands reached in immediately, pulling them away from the building as flames burst through the window above. Paramedics swarmed around them, checking vitals, placing oxygen masks, speaking in urgent tones. Michael couldn't focus on their words. He kept his eyes on the little girl as they loaded her into an ambulance, watching until the doors closed and it sped away into the night. Someone wrapped a blanket around his shoulders. Someone else pressed a bottle of water into his burned hands. The world felt distant and muffled, like he was watching everything happen to someone else. A firefighter approached, asking if he understood what he'd just done, how close he'd come to dying. Michael nodded slowly, but the truth was he couldn't fully process it yet. In the days that followed, Michael refused all interviews about the incident. He didn't want publicity or praise. The girl's family tried to thank him, but he politely kept his distance, asking only that she was recovering well. His management team advised him to use the story, to let the world see this heroic side of him. He refused. This wasn't about image or reputation. It was personal, sacred even. But the experience left marks deeper than the burns on his hands. Something had shifted inside him that night, an understanding that his platform and resources could save lives beyond his music. He began quietly funding children's hospitals and burn units, never attaching his name to the donations. Years passed, and Michael Jackson's fame exploded beyond anything the world had seen. He became more than a musician. He became a phenomenon, an icon, a target. With that fame came scrutiny, accusations, and a media machine hungry for scandal. During the darkest periods of his life, when tabloids painted him as a monster and the world seemed to turn against him, Michael would sometimes think about that night in 1984. He'd remember the girl's face, the way she trusted him without question, and wonder why that same benefit of doubt couldn't extend to his adult life. The girl, now a grown woman, had moved on with her life, and Michael never reached out. He'd given her the greatest gift he could, her life, and asked for nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. That's how he believed love should work, selfless, quiet, without conditions or expectations. His closest friends knew fragments of the story, but even they didn't understand the full weight it carried for him. That night had taught Michael that real heroism happened in the margins, in moments when nobody was watching and there was nothing to gain. It reminded him that beneath the sequins and spotlights, he was still human, still capable of making a difference in ways that had nothing to do with record sales or sold-out stadiums. When Michael died in 2009, the woman he'd saved was among the millions who mourned him. She'd kept the story private too, respecting his wish for silence. But she wrote him a letter he'd never read, thanking him not just for saving her life, but for teaching her that real goodness doesn't need an audience. The world never knew about Michael Jackson's daring rescue because he chose silence over celebration. In that choice, he revealed perhaps the most profound truth about his character, that his greatest act of courage wasn't walking into fire, but walking away from the applause that could have followed.